This morning, of course, our topic is leasehold lands. Just with the markets, we're seeing a lot of lease transactions, and very progressively, there's a lot of developments coming up. So we're pleased to have Mr. Barry Porrelli here this morning. Most of you know him with Porrelli Law, of course. Barry has an estimated 35 years in the industry, 15 years with Bassett and Company, and then, of course, making his own practice and his focus on native lands. And actually, Barry, I think with more than 40,000 real estate transactions, has done more native real estate than any lawyer in Canada. So we're really glad for you to be taking the time this morning. And with that, we'll turn it over to Barry.
Okay, I mean, native isn't all we do. It's about a third of our practice as far as residential real estate goes. So we want all your business, of course. We're probably the busiest real estate office outside of the Lower Mainland. I have 9 conveyancers now. We do upwards of 250 transactions a month on a busy month. So we're ready for this upcoming spring busy summer. But so Nadine asked me to talk today specifically about leasehold land, and it began with the board came out with new CPSs for First Nations land, and I actually sat on the committee that created those forms, and there was a bit, I mean, they're complicated, and there was a bit of a misunderstanding in the local community as to the use of those forms. And so I was going to speak to that and anything else you guys want me to talk about. But so the new forms that came out in October or so were as a result of, on First Nation land, the process for registration is different than on freehold. So on freehold, we file electronically, we push a button, and we get instant registration at land titles. In the Indian Land Registry, on many reserves, it can take honestly up to 7-8 months. So if you're doing a deal in Ticton at Skaha Hills, or cottages in Osoyoos, or Parker Cove and Vernon, there's a large what's called a gap in registration. And so I helped create was involved in the old First Nation CPS that came out years ago, which was trying to deal with that gap in registration. And everybody largely ignored it. And these days, everybody uses title insurance. And so the new forms built in the use of title insurance for closing on reserve. But the problem is Westbank First Nation is way more advanced than most bands in Canada with its governance structure, that we don't have that gap in registration. We can't electronically file, but we send the documents to the band office in that brick building just above the bridge, and we get registration same day. So when those forms came out, we found that realtors were using those new forms, which we helped create, and I was on that committee. But then I sent out a missive to every firm I could think of to say, don't use those new forms, because they really were built for a problem that doesn't exist on this reserve. So for Westbank, we should still be using the Westbank First Nation contract of purchase and sale. It badly needs updating too, because it hasn't been updated with all the updates that happen with the typical CPSs. So I'm working with the fellow who leads that committee to revise it. So there's some nice changes that we can make to that, and that will be forthcoming, I hope, in the next months. But in the meantime, do not use on Westbank First Nation the new board forms. Continue to use the Westbank First Nation CPSs. So just to quickly, for those of you who do deals outside of Westbank First Nation and you don't use the Westbank First Nation forms, it's complicated, and I don't know how many of you out there do deals on other reserves. The difficulty there was I don't know if I liked the idea, but they created 2 forms of contract. One where consent of the Crown was required for the assignment of the sublease, and one where it was not. So you have to be live to the issue. If you're doing a deal in Parker Cove or Turtle Landing in Vernon, you need to use the form where consent is required, because there's a clause in those leases that says you can't sell your land without the ministerial consent. Whereas in Skaha and cottages and Spirit Ridge, consent's not required, so you'll use the form where no consent is required. I mean, if anybody has questions about that, you can talk to me about it, or we can do that offline, because I think the majority of people's work are in West Bank, where the most of the activity is. So if you want to pull up unless there's, I mean, I don't mind questions and stuff like that, or we can save them till later, but if you want to, even with the West Bank First Nation CPS, we see incorrect completion of that form. If Taylor, you want to put that on the screen.
Just pull it up here. Sunbury?
Yes, if you, I'm not going to touch it because I'm technologically an idiot, but scroll down, scroll to the second
Scroll
page.
down to.
If you can get onto the second page there. So this clause, number 5, which again, if I have the opportunity to amend this, which we will try in the next months, it's not really, when we created it, it's not ideal. So what it says is, it's a built-in condition, and even the forms of CPS now, the conditions are in different places and stuff like that. So this sometimes gets overlooked. So there's a condition in the West Bank First Nation CPS that it's subject to review of the lease, and there's a blank to fill in the days. So we still see sometimes realtors not overlooking it and not even putting in a date, or putting in a date that doesn't jive or correspond with the rest of the condition removal date. So it could be fatal for you if you put a date in here that says 14 days and your condition removal date on the bulk of your conditions is something different. So what I find many do that are live to this issue, they just stroke this out. Most conditions on First Nation land incorporate a condition that it's subject to lease review and legal review and stuff like that. So either stroke this condition out and make sure that condition is in the bulk of your conditions, or at least make sure that the date in there corresponds with the date with the rest of your condition removals. Because and then sometimes this condition doesn't get removed because you'll just remove the conditions that are in your batch of conditions. And then, arguably you're out of contract. So
yeah, Barry, that's what I was going to ask. So you'd have to, if you do fill in the date here, you'd have to remove it twice.
Yeah, you have to ensure that gets picked up in your condition removal, or ideally stroke it out and just. I find that almost all realtors, I mean, if you're not live to it, it could be a problem. It definitely is an important condition that the lease be reviewed and you get legal advice, but that should be incorporated as a sort of just an auto insert in your conditions on First Nation land, right? Subject to the lease. Then it can't be overlooked in the condition removal process, or making sure the dates don't correspond, right?
Okay.
So that's the issue with that. We less of it, because usually when we see that, we get on the phone, or my main First Nation conveyancer gets on the phone, and sometimes it's after the fact, unfortunately, but we tell them about it, and it's never been a problem. But in a market where people might want to get out of contracts and stuff like that, it would be a problem. So and then if you wanted to scroll down a bit more, Taylor, to this addendum page after the signature page. Yeah, so right there, just go up one.
Go up one.
Sorry, I'm after the scheduling, right, correct?
No, just the one that references the blank page there. If you can get that whole page on the screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right there. That's good. So again, the lease, when we change it, we'll solve this problem. But so the original board form, when they came up with the First Nation CPS, which we largely mimicked when we created the West Bank First Nation, except we took out the gap provisions, anticipated that the entire lease would be attached as an addendum. And I fought back at that time, said nobody will do that. It's an 80-pager and we're killing a bunch of trees, and let's not do that. Anyways, I lost that fight. So the contract actually anticipates that a copy of the sublease will be attached to the agreement, which never ever happens. And I'm not suggesting you should do it. It's hard to say how to complete this page. This one says as per legal advice. Some say as per Barry Porrelli even, or it might say, to be provided. In a perfect world, it should have the sublease registration number. And if we have time, I'm going to pull up a parcel abstract where you can find that registration number. It's never really been fatal. I haven't seen it be a big problem, but it should be completed. That's sublease to be provided, or sublease, or it's a bit inelegant, but
just sublease to be provided, and then put the registration number.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. When you're taking a listing on First Nation land, I mean, you should have the sublease in hand as the lister.
Yeah.
They're not I don't think you guys get access to that registry. We're happy to provide that. If you're going to send us the deal, we'll pull it for nothing. So if you're listing a contract, I mean, we find it lots of times where the buyer comes to us and says, can you review the sublease? And we'll say, send us a copy. And the listing agent hasn't even pulled it. Not pointing fingers, but you should have that in hand when you're listing it, because that's something a buyer is going to want to see, right? So just like a parcel abstract, a title search, or something you would do on freehold land. And we're always happy to pull that for you. We're not a free service. We're not a charity. We want your business, and we'll do it for you if we get the deal. Not to be mercenary, but anyways, make sure that the forms are completed, and the West Bank First Nation form is used when you're. And we still see sometimes people using the freehold form on West Bank First Nation land, less and less, but for the people new to it or not used to it, you can't use the freehold CPS, and don't use the new First Nation CPS. Use the one specifically built for West Bank. It's unique.
When you see that, you have them put it on the proper form, or the brokerage should be having them put it on the proper form?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes though, we don't see it until it's gone firm. And, sometimes the buyer's reluctant to open it up in this market and stuff and say, we want you to,
And
enter
hope for the best.
and kill it. So sometimes they just decide to hold their nose, and it usually works. Like, it's not been a problem, to be honest with you. But one day, if somebody wants out of a contract, in this kind of a market where you get seller's remorse or something like that, the freehold contract says they're getting freehold title, and you can't deliver that on reserve. So it's important you use the right form. I haven't seen a lawsuit on that yet, and so sometimes the parties are amicable, they will redo it, and it's not a problem. Sometimes they don't want to bring it up and hope it's not discovered, and we don't make a big deal of it necessarily. We point it out to the parties when we see it, and it's up to the realtors how do they deal with it. So,
right. Sorry, Barry, we just had a question from Joy, just back to the Schedule A, and you've mentioned now that potentially these forms will be changed with that condition being removed, and perhaps this. Could we remove the Schedule A, or just no?
Well, no, because the front page of that contract, it's hard to scroll to. It says it references Schedule A. So the new forms, and I was insistent because they wanted to do it with this committee, wanted to do it with the same thing. I said, just reference that they're selling the subleasehold interest. And there's no reference to the actual lease being provided. So you'd have to amend the front page of the contract and the wording, and that'd be pretty complicated. So that's a good try, but not going to work.
Okay.
So that's sort of the short and long story on the new West Bank First Nation CPSs, the new provincial forms that are used outside of West Bank for any other band in, well, almost any other band in BC. Yeah, actually all other bands in BC. So I'm happy to just blather on about various things. I mean, Nadine asked me to talk about the dual registry, so I can briefly talk about that. So Lake Ridge Park, that subdivision by the band office above the bridge, it's 200 houses on Alexander, Michelle, Tomat, Derrickson, is what's known as Lake Ridge Park. And I could talk a whole hour on that one alone, but it was one of the First Nation subdivisions probably in Canada. Westbank First Nation's always been pretty progressive. So back in the 70s, they developed this residential community, and historically, Westbank, the Indian Land Registry was very imprecise. It wasn't very accurate, and it wasn't very protective. And so they decided at that time in the 70s to put the lands into the provincial land title system. So you have this awkward, unusual arrangement where it's one of three in British Columbia, and actually Tsawwassen under their new treaty put all their lands in the land title system, but it's very unusual generally to have First Nation land in the provincial land registry. So they decided to do it just because it would give buyers comfort that it was in a secure registry. And so you have this unusual arrangement where it's in both the Westbank First Nation self-governing registry and in the land title system. And so when we do deals there, it basically good for the lawyers. It doubles their legal costs because we got to do both a Indian land transfer and a freehold transfer. But it comes with some other problems because it attracts transfer tax because it's in the provincial land title system, which generally does not apply on reserve. This band's actually contemplating on passing a transfer tax. I'm dead set against it, but I don't think they'll listen to me.
Wow.
So that might occur next month. Other bands, Chiakin, lots of other bands in BC have done it, so they think they're losing lots of revenue. But so, anyways, what that's the story behind Lake Ridge Park. Is it's a dual registry. I did the last little part of that subdivision for the band in Bayview Court. There's a handful of the last lots that were released in Bayview Court that aren't dual registry and don't attract the transfer tax. But there's maybe 10 lots that aren't dual registry in that subdivision. I'm working with the band right now. Actually, they've been working on it for off and on for several years to modernize that lease, and it's now right firmly in their radar to modernize that lease. So I can't tell you too much about the mechanics or the costs, but what they're offering up, that lease comes due in the year 2074. So there's 50 some years left on it. So they're going to offer the residents, and it's hard to get financing because it's an older lease. CMHC doesn't approve it. It's in the provincial land title system. So they've after all these years, they've determined to work to remove it from the provincial land title system and offer up residents the opportunity to get a new and improved 125-year lease. So that'll be coming out probably. They've been talking about it for a long time, but it's definitely in the works right now. So they'll be offering up residents in there the opportunity to pay a sum of money, and the amount is to be determined, but they'll have a formula. And I'm asking them to be reasonable. They're usually fairly reasonable. And if it works out financially, economically for people, it'll be purely optional. But the residents there will be able to scrap their existing lease that's hard to sell because you can't get high ratio financing. Buyers have to have 20%. BMO, sometimes TD are the only lenders that will lend conventionally in there. So it's a hard market. And so the new lease will be a 125-year lease that is similar to all the more recent leases like Copper Sky, Sonoma Pines, West Harbor, that sort of thing. And so it'll definitely increase values. It'll be optional for people to take it. They can stay with the same crappy lease. There's nothing entirely wrong with that lease. It's just an older lease, hard to finance with a shorter term, or they can buy into the new arrangement. So there'll be more. You'll probably hear about that, not necessarily from me, but they'll be rolling that out probably in maybe community meetings, hopefully with stakeholders, with realtors and stuff like that in the months to come. But it's definitely, it languished for the longest time. It started in 2011, and I was part of trying to help them with that. We got stuck with trying to take it out of the provincial land title system. That was a hard go. I haven't helped them with that at all, but they now have Andre East, a good lawyer with Cloutier Mitchell, that's been overseeing it, and it's now something that will be shortly rolled out. So
Right. So just to understand what you said, they currently have a crappy lease, just 60 years, and then potentially they may have this 125-year lease, and you might have an option. You can take the existing lease or for purchase the new $125 or year lease.
Yeah, when it rolls out, and this, I don't think it'll be time limited, like at any time, like the current owners, it might be a large sum of money. It might be, I don't know, 10, 50, 100 grand. I don't know what the number will be. There's been some talk of it, but I'm not going to disclose that. So whatever the amount is, some people might not be able to fund it. They might have to take a mortgage to fund it. Many won't care because they're just not selling or not financing and not concerned about it. So yes, it should be an opportunity for owners and buyers in the future to opt into the new and improved lease, and hopefully the numbers are reasonable and it makes economic sense. What I'm saying to them is make sure that the value increase, because there will be a value increase. I mean, the lease today will be less valuable than a lease that's twice as long and financeable with any financial institution with 5% down, right? So it will definitely have a rise in values, and you guys can probably have some thoughts on what that might be, because they do, it's an active market even in Lake Ridge Park. Prior to this hot run that we're on, they were a harder sell, but now everything seems to sell. Nobody seems to care. There's nothing entirely wrong with that lease. It's a secure lease. It's not, when I say crappy, we've learned how to do these things better since 1975, and leases today are longer, and prepaid and CMHC insured, and so they're easily sold, right?
Right. And just for just back to with Lake Ridge, what you said, because of the dual registry, and everyone to take note when you're dealing with it, that it's double the legal cost, you said.
Yeah, it's roughly double. So we charge $21.50 for a purchase mortgage on freehold, and we charge $27.50 or something. So it's not double, but you got it's mainly, there's two sets of registration fees. So the registration fees at the band are $225 per document. So there's $450 more just in registration fees for the Indian Land Registry, and then a little bit more for the legal fees. But with the new lease, if for people that when it comes out and people opt into it, then they're just back to the normal reduced legal fees. So yeah.
Right. Barry, I just wanted to take it back to the contract, because we have a lot of new agents online, and we're getting some questions. Jeff, I did see your question on Holiday Park, that we'll come to that, because I had a question on that as well. But if you wouldn't mind, just say with the WFN contract, just an overview on the completion process. You referred to the gap, and some people aren't familiar with that, and how we should approach those completion and adjustment dates on leasehold land.
So on West Bank First Nation, you don't do anything different. We get same day registration. We don't get Insta registration like we do on freehold, where we just push the button from our desktop. So the completion possession, I mean, ideally don't have same day completion possession. We don't see that much anyways, but because if we send them the documents at 11 in the morning, we'll get registration by in the afternoon, mid-afternoon, whereas with freehold it's instant. So there's really no gap on West Bank First Nation,
and that's because they have their own autonomy, whereas on somebody outside of West Bank First Nations, a different reserve, it's different. And that we sort of wanted to touch on that contract in particular.
On the contracts that aren't West Bank First Nation.
Yeah. Just a
okay. So if you're doing a deal in Skaha Hills in Penticton, or cottages, which I did down in Osoyoos or Spirit Ridge or Parker Cove or Turtle Landing. So just a quick governance overview. So there's 630 bands in Canada, 200 and so are BC. Most of those bands are what we call Indian Act bands. They're governed by the Department of Indian Affairs, which is called Indigenous Services Canada. All registrations go through Vancouver and then to Ottawa, and literally take up to 7 months. It's actually an entirely broken system. So in West Bank, they have what's called self-government, and there's a handful of bands in BC that have this: Chatkin and Chilliwack, Tsleil-Waututh, Tsawwassen, none in the interior, not Okanagan, not Soyuz, not Penticton. So those bands that are self-governed or have that model have their own self-governing registry, and usually somebody on site, a registry on site, like West Bank First Nation, where we send our documents to. We still have to physically send them originals. So if we're doing a deal with somebody from out of town, we can't, for the provincial registry, we can rely on copies. We need to get originals, which is sometimes, it's got to be couriered and couriered back. We courier the documents to West Bank First Nation, and then they upload it into the cloud in Ottawa, and we get registration very quickly. But for those other bands like the Okanagan and Vernon, the Soyuz Penticton locally, the originals would go to Vancouver, sit on somebody's desk there for an indeterminate amount of time, weeks, months. It's just a bureaucracy and a staffing issue, and it's been this way forever, and it's getting worse, not better. And then it goes to Ottawa, and it sits there for some time. So we do so much of this. The banks get on us all the time because they say, "Send us your report." In Freehold, we're supposed to report within 60 days. Sometimes we're a year out because we haven't got registration, and so the mechanics are awful. And that was the purpose of this one you've got on the screen there, where it says third party. So there's two choices here. One says third party approval not required, and the other choice is third party approval required. And so the one where approval is required is really problematic. So the older leases out there, and I just looked this morning to confirm, we don't do much work in Parker Cove or Turtle Landing. I'm old enough to remember when those leases failed and they scared me, so I stay away from them back in the 90s. But they have provisions in their head lease from the Crown that says you cannot sell your property without the Crown's consent. So these older leases, you need to use this form that says third party approval required. And the mechanics of it, they have this awkward trust completion date, final completion date. And for when third party approval is required, the problem with it, we solved the problem with closing by getting title insurance, and we close on possession, and title insurance covers if a problem happens where the bounce documents happen within that 8-month registration period. Title insurance covers the loss. And I've never seen it happen, but when you're talking about buying something for several $100,000, you usually don't release funds until you get registration, and title insurance historically has covered that. But as we drill down, title insurance does not kick in until all approvals are granted. And so for these leases where Crown consent is required, like Parker Cove and Desert Cove and Turtle Landing, actually Desert Cove, I just looked, does not require approval. Parker Cove, Turtle Landing do. It anticipates that you don't give possession until you get approval, and then you can close on title insurance because it covers, and then you'll still have the delay in registration. I honestly don't know how many people are going to buy into that and understand that, and maybe one day for your group who are doing deals on those reserves, because it's hard to enlighten you guys in 5 or 10 minutes on that. But if you're doing deals in Parker Cove or Turtle Landing, you should be using this form that says third party approval is required. And the summary of that is possession is not granted until the consents of the Crown have been provided. And honestly, that takes months. That usually takes months. So how can you do business when you can't get possession? You're not going to get paid until some day later, and you don't even know when that's going to be. So I think.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Carry on.
No, I was going to say, do they then, because we see people are doing contracts in Parker Cove, and they're not waiting 8 months for possession or several months. So is it by way of an undertaking or to provide the funds, or granting them early possession?
I think it's, even the lawyers, because very few people do much of this, even the lawyers haven't figured out this new form. They just close on title insurance thinking that it covers it. And I don't even know if they look at which form they should be using, whether it's the one where approval is required or approval isn't. Maybe someday we've never been beat on that. We've always used title insurance. Again, we don't do work in Parker Cove or these developments where Crown approval is required, and not just for that reason. They historically, I don't want to, demean those subdivisions, but they're not the solid leases like we see today on other reserves. But really, you really can't get protection for a buyer if you release funds and grant possession prior to getting Crown approval. If Crown approval isn't provided, and to be honest with you, I've never seen it not provided. In my group of this committee, there was one other lawyer and a notary. One was practicing quite a bit in the Musqueam Reserve, which is just outside of Vancouver, up by the university there. They say that happens not uncommonly. The band actually looks at every transfer and determines whether the buyer is creditworthy and stuff like that. So it's a bit of an academic issue, but it's conceivable someday somebody might get beat, because title insurance will not cover you when consent is required, like it is in Parker Cove, and the Crown doesn't consent. The risk is low, like very low, but it exists. So, but I don't know how. I've never seen somebody wait to grant the keys until the Indian Land Registry does their stuff, because it's a moving target and it takes months, right? So we didn't know really what the answer was to this, but that's the mechanics of this contract. If you're dealing with Skaha Hills or cottages, like most of them recent year leases, the Okanagan Reserve really has very little development. They're just sort of culturally that way. But the Soyuz, Penticton, there's lots of development coming, and all their leases generally don't require Crown consent. So we close on the gap insurance that title insurance provides, and in this contract we built in a provision for title insurance and who pays for it, or whether it'll be split. It's usually shared, and so we have no issues with the modern day subdivisions and leases. But some of the older leases on the Okanagan Reserve, there might be others. I haven't looked at them all, but the subdivisions that we do work in, we just get used to buying title insurance and closing on that, and some months later we get registration. The other thing that is not commonly known is, because ownership doesn't pass for several months, the seller is always surprised when we tell them, you got to keep your insurance on that home for several months, right? Because if it burns down, it might not be covered. So even though they've been paid, the contract and at the beginning of this, the description of the introduction on these forms says, advise your sellers to keep their insurance in place until, not just till they've been paid like on freehold, but until they've been advised by the lawyer that the title has been transferred. Because it, with wildfires and stuff like that, it could be an issue. Anyways, it's a complicated thing, and there's no really easy answer. I'm glad I practice mostly in West Bank and on reserves that are have leases that don't require consent, because it works marvelously. But for those older leases, then it's problematic.
Mm-hmm. So just back to the contract then, the third party approval, we know you said Parker Cove, Desert Cove doesn't require it. Is there I guess the listing agent, obviously it will be onerous of them to determine the nature of the lease and what's required. Or
yeah, I mean, I find that, again, not to besmirch anybody, but frankly, you guys don't look at the leases, right? Lawyers half the time don't look at the leases. I live in this world, so we're concerned about
fair enough.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you as a practical thing, I've been doing this for 36 years. I've not seen it be a problem. So it lives mostly in lawyers' minds, but title insurance doesn't cover you if consent's required. Most realtors, many lawyers and notaries have not read the leases. And when I like I spoke at a conference for the Law Society a few years ago. I said, don't practice in this area if you're not going to do work in a subdivision and not read the leases and get familiar with it. So, you know, economics are, lawyers and notaries do business anywhere, and that's sort of my pet peeve. But so yeah, you should ideally know, or the buyer, when it says subject to legal advice, it's probably more the buyer's obligation to hire a lawyer that can point this out to them, to say that, but to know which form you should be using, which is the buyer who creates it. They should know, but it's a really murky area, because again, most lawyers aren't aware of it, and most lawyers aren't even aware of these new forms, to be honest with you, to my knowledge. But so yeah, in a perfect world, and I don't know that exists. You know, when you took a listing, you'd have a copy of the head lease, sublease. You know, we have all these. We don't post Parker Cove and stuff on our website, but we post all of the other leases in West Bank and in Penticton and in Osoyoos on our website, so you can just go there and grab them. We don't have the subleases because, you know, in Sonoma Pines there's 600 subleases, so we can't post the subleases. But you know, if we're doing the deal, we'll always pull the sublease for you, a buyer or a seller. And you can look at that, but the consent is usually contained in the head lease, and modern day leases don't require consent, but leases that were done in the 90s and earlier, we've just learned how to do these things better as time passes, and some of the older leases still require Crown consent to a sublease or an assignment of sublease, right?
Mm-hmm. So with this third-party approval required contract, would you mention SCAHA? Would this be applicable to?
No. So the other one says third-party approval not required, which is the vast majority of them, because most of the development, you know, the majority of the development has happened in the last 20 years, both in West Bank and in Penticton and Osoyoos. So the modern day leases generally don't have that provision that consent's required. So Skaha Hills does not. Skaha Hills is really the only residential subdivision that I think they have on Penticton. In Osoyoos, there's cottages, which definitely, actually cottages are unique. It requires it, but title insurance, when we did that subdivision, we convinced title insurance to cover the gap. So we're not concerned about cottages. So, I mean, if you want to know about cottages and, you know, SCAHA, you can always phone us, and I'm happy to get you the lease. It's on our website, or talk to you about it on the hopes that we're going to do your deal for your client. But we don't, again, do work with Parker Cove and
Right.
Turtle Landing.
Okay. So I guess what we've been asking, and I just see another question came up from Irene, that there's no resource or a list anywhere that we can go to see who needs third-party approval. We'd have to refer to the head lease and probably speak with you.
Yeah, there's no repository for this information. It's in the Indian Land Registry, just like a title search would be for freehold. But unfortunately, you have to be approved to get access to that registry, and it's generally lawyers and notaries and bands that have that access. So, I mean, when we do a deal for a buyer, wherever they are, we always, when they leave, they get a copy of the head lease and sublease. It's in their paperwork. So when they sell, they should have that if they keep their paperwork. And it's always easily accessible for us because we have access to that registry. So it is a problem on the Okanagan for realtors, because I don't know that you have access to. Can you pull parcel abstract reports and stuff? I don't know that you can.
Yeah, we can pull just the basic parcel abstract, like this one here. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you pull down on there, so for example, this was my mom's house. Actually, I shouldn't have sent you this one. This one's too simple, but
I saw that.
Yeah. Usually at Copper Sky, they go on for pages, and they're harder to understand. But you know, I don't know that you have access. So that registration number 255802 sublease, we can go to the registry and just, you know, it's free, and we pull a copy of that sublease. So I don't know if that's available to you guys. You can pull the parcel abstract report, but and you can use that registration number to insert into your CPS, like I was talking about, to describe the sublease. I don't know if you can pull that sublease or the head lease. I think because for non-lawyers, they have to redact all the information. They take out the purchase price and they take out the people's names and stuff like that. So I don't know if it's available to you to pull those. If you can pull those,
Yeah, I think
then you can review it and see if there's Crown consent required. It makes for some dull reading, but the Parker Cove, which I just looked at this morning, I think I'm right, and the Turtle Landing have that old holdover in their head lease. This is a sublease that says ministerial Crown consents required.
right. Okay, well, we can determine that and we know we can call you. But if we go back to that third-party contract approval at Leasehold, could you just sort of walk us through with the trust, the dates and what I guess how would we approach this one? The same because the title insurance or?
Yeah,
Taylor,
okay.
can
Well,
you scroll down to the trust dates and completion? Just sort of a general explanation.
Yeah. You might put me on the spot a bit because I haven't looked at this in a long time, but so yeah, keep scrolling. All that stuff is
there. It is. Hold it.
So yeah, so the trust completion date is the date when no approval is required is the date of possession. So you'll put in the trust completion date will be April 1st. And in paragraph 5C there, it says the buyer will authorize the release of the funds to the lawyer on the final completion date, which is 8 months later, or if possession is prior to the final completion date, then on the trust completion date. So then you got to scroll down to paragraph 7. Paragraph 8, actually. So paragraph 8 should say tenancies, if any, and then you describe the tenancies, or you'll say not applicable, at 12 noon on the first. It should probably always default to the first day after the final completion date. But then it goes on to say, because that anticipates you're going to get possession 8 months later. But then it goes on to say, notwithstanding this, the buyer will have possession on the first day after the trust completion date if they elect to do that and they get title insurance. So the way you would fill that in is to, as I say, the top one would say the first day after the final completion date, and the other one would be you should probably put the first date in all those blanks, the first day in every instance, because nobody's going to wait 8 months for their money or for possession. And
Right.
then you check in the box about who pays for title insurance. Usually it's shared. On those, we find that's fair that it's shared because it gets the buyer possession, but it also gets the seller paid, so it benefits both of them. And there's lots of other benefits to title insurance for the buyer, so it's nice that it's shared. Or the seller will say, or the buyer will say, I'll pay it just to facilitate. Unfortunately, the cost of title insurance on reserve is $500. There's only 2 providers, First Canadian and Stewart, whereas on freehold it's $150. So the cost of title insurance is more on reserve just because they're got a monopoly on it. So you pick those dates, you check off who pays for the title insurance, and then you close and grant possession the day after the trust completion date that you inserted on the page before. And then the adjustment dates are just, the same dates, April 1st or whatever, right?
Well, so if we're writing the contract today and we want to say subjects are 2 weeks and completion is, we'll say 10 days after. So that takes us to, April 1st is reasonable, or March 23rd for the trust completion date.
Yeah. So on the page prior was paragraph.
Taylor, can you go back?
That you insert the trust completion date in paragraph 5.
Yeah, right here.
Which is basically the closing date.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then the possession date, if you put in the first day after that on paragraph 7, then you'll get possession the day after the trust completion date, which is similar, same as freehold. You close one day, possession the next. So trust completion date is look at that as the closing date.
Right.
Although title doesn't transfer, which is the hard part. But the closing date is the trust completion date, and the possession date is the first day after the trust completion date. And then you determine who pays for the title insurance. We get gap coverage, and we release funds to the seller lawyer on the trust completion date. Keys get released the next day, and then we wait 8 months for title to transfer. But everybody's happy because they've got paid and they've got the keys. Keep in mind the seller should keep their insurance on until the title transfers.
Right. Okay. The wording on Schedule A, as per registration number or lease registration under remarks. So again, back to Schedule A, West Bank First Nations, where we're not providing the sublease. We're just going to say to be provided and then put the registration number that we find on the abstract.
Actually, you don't have to say to be provided. If you put the registration number, that really just, the contract anticipated you'd attach the sublease, but if you just attach the sublease number, that's good enough. I mean, you should still have the sublease to provide to buyers because they and their lender are going to want to see it. But if you just have that registration, like on my mom's since passed away, but on her property when she owned that was in Sun Village, you just put down that sublease registration number. That would be ideal. That would be ideal. Yeah. Okay.
Oh my gosh, I'm looking at the time. So Barry has provided the West Bank First Nations contract actually has some terms and conditions and a guideline for what you should have there. And the contract itself addresses all of the differentiations with a leasehold property. Are there any, and we don't have it in front of us here, but particular subjects that you highly recommend, obviously reviewing the lease and such, but more to that?
No, I think it's just, I mean, the one good thing is we created a new First Nations PDS, an HOA form, which is sort of like a strata. The Strata Property Act doesn't really apply on reserve, so we create these homeowner associations. I didn't provide that to you, but it's part of the new package that was rolled out last fall. So do use those. Ideally, don't use the freehold PDS. Use the new. It's called First Nation PDS and an HOA form. So it's similar to a strata PDS. It just the language has changed. We don't reference strata, but there is an HOA fee. It looks a lot like a strata PDS. So use the West Bank First. This I'm going to confuse the hell out of you guys, but use the West Bank First Nation CPS on West Bank First Nation, but use the new and improved First Nation PDS as the property disclosure statement and the HOA form for all properties, whether in West Bank or not. Right. But I don't think you need any special language. Legal advice on the lease is built into the contract. I find that most realtors still have that even in their list of terms or conditions. And so beyond that, no, I don't think there's anything special that has to be provided.
Okay. Again, looking at the time, Taylor, can you see some of the questions here in the chat? Jeff has one. I'm just going to quickly, we're obviously seeing that there's common practice that's been out there for years that's not necessarily correct, but it's been pushed through the system, and unfortunately that there hasn't been too many issues with it, and it's not the correct way to do it, but it's common practice at the moment. And one of them would be turtle lodges out in Lake Country, where we're seeing the contract put on a freehold contract all the time. And also, Jeff, you had the question on Holiday Park Resort, and what they do in the addendum is they would make some references to leasehold and that title means leasehold, etc. But it's still on a freehold contract, and they are being processed that way. So until we improve, that's how, on a hope and a prayer, how they're being.
Can I just say something, Nadine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and I do a lot of them, and yes, I do use the residential contract of purchase and sale for that. There is no third party approval for turtle lodges, but for the form of the contract of purchase and sale was designed primarily for the purchase on freehold residence. But it does say in here, if your transaction involves a house or other building under construction, a lease, business, or an assignment, other special circumstances, including the acquisition of land situated on First Native lands, additional provisions not contained in this form may be needed. So what we've been typically doing, the other provisions that we're doing in here, just to protect everyone involved, we're always providing the head lease, the sublease, as well as making a note for under the terms and conditions that it references that, you know, this is a leasehold property, and those provisions are put into that contract or for the protection. Whether it's you know, it should be done that way. We've been doing it that way for a very, very long time, and I'm definitely open to any suggestions for change on that. But Nadine's right. We've always done it on the regular CPS.
But it should probably be on the no third party required contract.
Yeah. So sometimes that's how we cure the problem in West Bank when they use the freehold CPS. Rather than rewrite the contract, they'll just reference that this is leasehold, not freehold. But yeah, I mean, these new forms were designed to be used. Third party consent is required, unfortunately. And title insurance does not cover. So the lawyers and the buyers and the realtors that are doing work there, if Crown consent wasn't forthcoming, title insurance wouldn't insure the loss if the title didn't transfer. That's the bottom line. So, you know, you've been doing it for years, and I didn't mean to criticize Turtle Landing. I'm sure it's a lovely development and it's worked for a long, long time, but it's just not the lease that we see these days in the more modern day. And it does require Crown consent to the assignment of sublease. Pretty sure I just looked at that. I can confirm that. But if it does require Crown consent, unfortunately, Crown consent doesn't come until much, much later, until it's been submitted to Vancouver and Ottawa. And if somehow, someday, there was a problem in the subdivision and it was in the middle of a transfer and the Crown refused to consent and funds have been released, title insurance wouldn't cover the gap. But okay. No, you've been doing it a while. I've been doing it a long time. I've never seen that happen. It's always worked, and maybe that's how we do business, right?
Yeah. And it's similar to, I mentioned Holiday Resort, Jeff, you were asking that they do that as well. And they have their own addendum explaining, because it's summer RVs on there.
Yes, they hand out a copy of the freehold CPS, and that's what they say to use. So they almost insist upon it. I mean, it's just a matter of, is it right? But, you know, you don't necessarily need Holiday Park approval when you do a deal either. They just want it with us on a CPS freehold with their terms. That's all they care about.
And the same with myself. I've actually written them on the leasehold contracts and have been asked to redo them just on a regular CPS. So that's just what we've always been doing.
I know, Barry, that we're running overtime here. So I think he's looking at something.
I might have to relook at that, Parker Cove. I hope I didn't misspeak myself. I might go offline and just confirm that again, that like a sublease requires consent, but now maybe an assignment doesn't. There are lots of leases out there that say that. I'll determine that definitively, and I'll email you, Nadine, on that afterwards.
Perfect. And that would be for Turtle Lodges? Or Parker Cove, or Holiday Park.
Yeah, I don't know about Holiday Park. I don't know if I have a copy of that lease, but I'll try to get the answers on all three of those.
Yeah, I can talk to you afterwards. We're overtime. We might just take a couple of questions if you have that time, Barry. Just a quick one from Jeff. Taylor, Jeff, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. It's just, I've seen out on West Bank First Nation contracts to purchase a sale where other realtors and to be honest, Barry, they've said that you're the one that said they should put it in, but I'd never heard of this before, that the buyer has been advised that regardless of any of the term of any head lease, pad rental is generally a month-to-month tenancy. West Bank First Nation law potentially provides that in the case of redevelopment of the park, the tenancy agreement will be terminated on 12 months notice and payment of actual and reasonable moving expenses to a maximum of $2,000 currently. So, I mean, I know if you're not on native land, my understanding is it's 10,000 plus possibly assessed value, but they're writing in that the max you're going to get is 2,000 period.
Yeah, I did tell somebody that one day, and I think it's not bad. We do that when we sign somebody up that's buying in the manufactured home park in West Bank. We put that in there because, you know, Horgan, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, I mean, even provincially, there used to be very little in the way of protection for redevelopment of a park. West Bank First Nation, actually, frankly, in Okanagan and Soyuz and stuff, there's no protection because the provincial law doesn't apply. But West Bank did adopt, at that time, was similar to the provincial legislation that said you get a year's notice, a year's free rent, and some moving costs. So people, you know, when people phone us, when you are kind enough to send us referrals on to buyers, we do gently bring that up that you know, it's affordable housing. You don't own the land. You can be displaced. It doesn't matter whether you're on or off reserve. The protections on reserve are a little less robust because you don't have the same. I think it's more than 10,000, but you don't have the same protections that you do off reserve. But frankly, it's never occurred on this reserve ever where a park's been redeveloped, and it's to my mind very unlikely to happen because, you know, a developed park is. I mean, when it was a big box revolution and they were putting up, you know, Home Depots and stuff, and you know those footprints are getting smaller, and so sometimes that is the highest and best use. So the likelihood of those parks being redeveloped is remote. It's never happened in West Bank. It's happened in Kelowna with Hiawatha, and it's happened in, I think, Lake Country, but it's never happened here. But people should be aware that they're on a month-to-month. And if I had a bit of time, I could explain that to you too. We get calls all the time. The lease in Berkeley Estates is coming due in the year 2027. You know, there are only 6 years in that lease. Well, I'd like to give me 2 minutes to address that. So just because the lease is coming due in 5 years, or sometimes there are no leases. Ron Derrickson has parks. He owns the land. He doesn't have to have a lease. The month-to-month pad renter is not a party to that lease. So if you see a 99-year lease in Jubilee or Paradise or some other manufactured home park, that doesn't necessarily give you comfort. You're on a month-to-month pad rent, and in redevelopment, you can be displaced. Just because there's no lease or a few years left in lease, again, doesn't mean that when that lease comes to an end, you're going to get kicked out. Usually that just means you have a new landlord. And I've never ever seen it happen in my practice where just because the lease ends, the homeowners are displaced. They usually are just paying those leases. I know you're running out of time. Berkeley Estates, those are all what are called percentage rent leases. And so they leased out the lands to a developer and they get 25% of the rents till the lease ends. When the lease ends, they can't wait for that day to come because they get 100% of the rent tax-free because they're band members, Indians. And so when that lease comes to an end, it would be ridiculous that the landholder would terminate a viable, you know, fully developed park that's producing millions of dollars worth of income tax-free to try to convert it into a condo or a resort development. It just makes no economic sense at all. So people, you know, the lenders, somehow some of the lenders lately are saying, I want a lease that's 5 years longer than the amortization of the loan. And I fight them all the time on that, but some lenders just have that policy. It's not a CMHC policy because they don't just always get it. But so yeah, the deal with homeowners, they're on month-to-month pad rents. If you're in Calgary or White Rock or Kelowna, you can be displaced. The protections on provincially are stronger than they are in West Bank. Frankly, I sat on the West Bank First Nation Economic Development Commission. We drafted a policy that said if there ever is a redevelopment of a park, the park has to come to the council and provide them with the plan, just like they did with Hiawatha and West Bank. That was at a time in Kelowna when there was no provincial protections, and the city said, we're not going to allow the rezoning until you make it right with these homeowners. And so they had to pay much more than just, year's rent. And so even though West Bank by law has those minimum protections, they have a general policy that says, if there is redevelopment, you've got to come to us with a plan. And I have a feeling they wouldn't allow homeowners to be displaced with just that minimal lack of protection.
Yeah. Okay. And we're really running out of time, but I'm just going to take one quick question here from Chris, and it's just back to Lakeridge and the fact that the PTT is applicable on some of the lots there or homes. And he's asking, would also then the 20% foreign buyers, unlike WFN, of course, that too would be applicable?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's right. I had a lady from India. She was a doctor, and she was buying in Lakeridge Park and got hit with that 20%. It's ridiculous. So, but beyond that, everywhere else, there's no spec tax. There's no transfer tax. Be prepared, because transfer tax may be coming. But generally on reserve, there is no transfer tax, and they've been all reserves have been exempted from the spec tax too.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. There are some excellent questions